Hello and welcome to Our Stories and Ourselves, a podcast about how our minds make stories and stories make us. My name is Kirsty.
And in this show, I talk about the stories we tell ourselves about the world, the stories we tell ourselves about history, and about how the way we think shapes these stories and shapes us.
Today we have my first interview episode with guest Thomas O'Mahony, a podcaster of Beneath the Skin and Lions Led by Donkeys, podcast producer of This Guy Sucked, among other shows. And I think it's fair to call you an archivist, or at least a digital conservationist, among other things. Tom, welcome to the
That's
show.
correct. Thank you very much for having me, Kirsty. I'm very excited to rant for 40 minutes about digital preservation.
Cool. Anything I missed in the intro?
Nope, nothing. You said my name correctly, which is 100 extra points for you. It's something that I know people struggle with, but yeah, I think you got everything.
Cool. Well, I think I may listen to too many of your podcasts, so I've heard you say it a few times. So, this episode was prompted by me. Wait, what did we call it for Blue Sky? Re-skeeting? Ugh. Anyway, I shared a post on Blue Sky from the Internet Archive talking about DVD rot and mentioned the range of things that can affect which stories survive, and you chimed in. So you said you wanted to talk about the importance of preserving physical media, and this got me thinking about ancient clay tablets, because of course, DVD rot to clay tablets, that makes perfect sense, right?
I mean, ironically, it does. Like, you know,
Okay.
it makes a direct one-to-one connection in terms of like all, I suppose, preservation of any sort of physical object suffers from physical degradation, and even like I suppose we will get into even the heralded and hated by Neil Young format, the CD is vulnerable to this, and even other like supposedly secure digital formats as well. But I'll let you continue before I chime in.
Absolutely. So the earliest written records we have are clay tablets written in cuneiform, which I always said as cuneiform until I listened to an episode of You're Dead to Me recently. Anyway, apparently they're both valid, but they used cuneiform, so I'm going to do the same. Anyway, these tablets were created with impressions in clay and then left to dry. And the biggest collection that's survived is from several hundred years BC and is the Library of Ashurbanipal. It's from the ruined city of Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq. The city burned in 612 BC, but this actually worked in history's favour as the fire fired the clay and actually preserved the tablets rather than destroying them. So some clay tablets were fired on purpose, like other ceramics, when they were considered important. But many that have survived have been by accident due to fires. So it's kind of one of the few moments in history where a conflict leading to a library being set on fire was a good thing for historical preservation. I also love that the existence of this collection tells us that 2,600 years ago, people were collecting and archiving physical media. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's funny in that one of the markers, I suppose, in terms of historical preservation of civilization or society is the invention of new forms of specifically data management. Because if you look at cuneiform tablets, like it's all data tabulation, data storage, just in a literal physical sense on a clay tablet. And you know, the methods of storage, whether they had been fired, like you said, like traditional ceramics, or unfired, that's just a different form of data management and data storage. And it's once we move into, I suppose, the civilization mode of tracking and storing things for referral back to, that's a really, really early form of the preservation of physical media and preservation of history. Because if you look at, say, cuneiform tablets that are related to stuff like harvest numbers, taxation, these are all data management systems. So someone can then go and reference it like, oh, well, your grain tithe was higher last year, but not this year. What's going on?
Yeah, that's a really good example, and it's also why this is just the beginning. More recently, of course, there's been fires that have been not so good. I'm sure you're familiar with the Public Records Office in Dublin burning in 1922.
Yep.
Which obviously was the wider conflict we won't get into, but the the fire was a definite tragedy for record keeping. But interestingly, also a great example of the importance of backups, because I read an article recently that they've actually been able to restore an amazing amount of the information from those records because there were backups of those records held in other places. So that's really cool.
This is something that, historically, for historians at least, and I suppose for anyone who looks to the past for different information, has always been an issue. If you look at before the proliferation of really literacy among I suppose you call them lay people, you had information and data storage in the forms of educated elites. That could be priests, that could be nobles who were able to read, and then the information we passed out through oral history. If you then look, I suppose, about the 7th to 9th century and the abundance of illuminated manuscripts, these are like the replication of data into what would be considered having a backup, because if all the Bibles in the world burned and one survived, then you have a reference point to work off of. And like for historians, shout out to Eleanor Yanniga as always. Like the lie that the Dark Ages were these like poor, ignorant times is the Dark Ages referring to a lack of sources, and that's because of for one reason or another the original materials being scarce, destroyed, or missing. And this is something that I think people are talking about. We're entering a digital dark age, which is something that I'll talk about, I suppose, later on in the episode. But this is something that is an ever-present issue of how to preserve history, how to, preserve data, and how to properly store it, and as part of preservation, but also once context for what the data means has passed, how do we then interpret that data retrospectively?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because, one of the great things about Ashurbanipal's library is that some of the cataloguing information was also preserved, which gives us lots of useful context, and reminding me of a conversation I had yesterday where we were working with a data set that did not have as much metadata as would have been ideal. And some of the variables were just like, okay, it's a 0. I do not know what 0 means in this context. Therefore, this data is useless.
And but that's something that, like, I think in terms of like historical research, and particularly for historical preservation, that context is so important. Like with Beneath the Skin, for example, myself and Matt, we went to Switzerland last year to get this what remained of a huge collection and donated to the Bishopsgate Institute in London. And it was the collection of this guy, Rooney Inhelder, who unfortunately passed away in 2001, if I remember correctly. And the stuff that we found in there was super interesting because he was a very particular cataloger. So everything was sorted into big ring binders. All the photos had been annotated of where they were taken, what year they were taken, who was in them. And that helps us piece together the story of, maybe people who we've seen in photos previously and like we would recognize them because of their tattoos, but then it puts a name to the person, and then we can take it as another step from there, because if we have a name and a rough geographic area and date, it's so much easier to find out more information about that person. And that these kind of documents and collections of documents adding context to data, like what you said with this is a 0, I don't know what this 0 is, so I guess I'm just not going to work. That's what the work of data management, data storage, the preservation of actual physical materials is so important, because like each little letter or picture adds another clue to uncovering the entire picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that context is really crucial. But I think I've rattled on enough. So you wanted to talk about DVD rot and when our physical media does degrade.
Yeah, so with the advent of CDs and the move towards the digital format, everyone in general, what happens with technological advancement, it becomes more ergonomic to our lives, it becomes smaller, it becomes more efficient, or so we seem, all these things. And DVDs and CDs were no different. They were seen as a much more compact and efficient data storage system. Um, so you didn't have VHS players, you didn't have VHS tapes, you didn't have vinyl records or record players. Like, it became much more of a space efficient storage medium. And with all kind of technological advancement, like, people kind of like are in awe of it and rush towards it. And ironically, Neil Young of all people hates MP3s. He's a very, very staunch advocate for the theory that when the digitization of MP3s came about, the algorithm that was used to digitize sound, there was a flaw in it. So there was a lot of data that was lost. So the way that vinyl records work is that the needle travels along the groove, and the indentations on the groove then travel up the needle and are converted into sound. If there's millions of videos that are very good at explaining this, but what it did was it turned that physical aspect of what music was, because sound is just waves. The groove, the needle moves along it, and it generates these waves that's converted into sound through the speakers. And what CDs did was digitized and converted it into a binary code. Ones and zeros, these are things that everyone knows about, but there's a certain amount of audio information that is lost in that conversion. And what happens is, in order for a more compact and like, on the face of it, more efficient data storage system, that was the trade-off. And now you have like multiple different lossless formats that are like higher fidelity than stuff like MP3s, that people like me, who are nerds who own an iPod in 2025, care about. But that kind of trade-off of efficiency versus the kind of loss of fidelity was accepted by most people, and everyone had Walkmans, and that transition from using like tapes into CDs. I remember tapes. I'm not old enough to have lived through the heyday of it, but the tapes they can be physically damaged quite easily. That then almost renders them useless. Although there are some preservation techniques which I'll talk about later on. But the story of that trade-off of this is more efficient, the past is useless. Then you saw people selling off their vinyl record collections en masse, which a lot of people have now gone to lengths to restore. But what you had was people built up these massive collections of CDs, and the CD became the preferred storage format for audio. And the problem is, which people didn't really realize at the time, is that CDs, while they contain digital data information, are still a physical media. And
Mhm.
physical media always has its flaw points. If you have a record, it can get warped because of environmental factors. It can get scratched, which all affect how efficient it is at storing the data on the vinyl record. The limitation with CDs is because of it being digital data stored on a physical media. The way a CD is constructed is that like it's a series of laminate layers on a disc, and what happens is over time those layers can separate and that data is lost.
So that's the mechanism, because I'd sort of been wondering that, because I did, tear apart a couple of CDs, the free, like the AOL online DVD or CDs or whatever they were that you'd get for free to try and convince you to sign up to their internet. They were great for art projects, but yeah, that's really interesting in that separation is part of what causes that data loss.
So there's also other factors. So to get technical, data is stored on CDs at specific points in a certain polarity, and over time that polarity of those data points can flip. Now, most CD players will have some sort of correction software that can flip those. It preserves it, but really, like what we talk about with disc rot is like the laminated layers separating. CDs can also warp as well. It's a thing that people don't really know about. Also, environmental factors can affect it. The temperature of the space that they're stored in can accelerate that separation. This can be due to the degradation of like one or more of the layers of the CD. The adhesive that was used as well can break down over time. This is something that the Jesse Knight collection, which Matt was a Welsh tattoo artist who passed away in the 90s. Matt got her collection into the National Museum of Wales, and when we were talking to the conservationist there about the collection, she was like, a lot of this was board that was painted on that was then stuck to a harder backboard with a kind of a sticky back plastic. And what has happened is, because it's plastic, it degrades over time. And now having to figure out ways to preserve that piece of art without damaging its integrity, because petrochemical produced products will degrade over time, and we are unto dust, and dust we shall return. Same with the CDs. But yeah, so what has developed over time is that a lot of these CDs are now essentially useless. And this happens with all sorts of media as well. This happens with VHS tapes becoming damaged over time. I'm in the middle of a project of digitizing a series of tapes, and you have to be very, very careful because, like, one, you're working with older technology. Like, I have a decent VCR player from the early 2000s. It has a HDMI port, which is interesting. Yeah, but it has HD copyright protection though, so I can't capture it using the HDMI cable. But you're using older technology that has moving parts that any one point of failure can cause the machine to chew up the tape. And obviously, because I'm dealing with other people's property, I have to be very careful with it. But there is an aspect particularly with CD rot, that I think there's a very social aspect to it, in that when CDs came around, it was this almost utopian idea of the data-driven future, that like all these things will be permanent because they are not reliant on the physical form of a vinyl or a VHS cassette tape, and it's the same with books and with movies and all these other things that relied on you having a piece of a physical object in front of you in order to access the information inside. There was a viewpoint, particularly in the late 90s and early 2000s, that it's very Fukuyama, like we're living in the end of history. We're in the end of worrying about libraries burning down.
Yeah, don't get me started on books, especially now that Amazon has stopped people from downloading their books and manually putting them onto the Kindles. That's yeah.
Don't worry. That's a point I have prepared for later as well.
I'll bet. Yeah, it does seem like there was that kind of, we're living in the future. We only need digital stuff. Was definitely seemed to be pretty prominent when I was a teenager. And then especially as the MP3 players came out, and I could replace my entire CD collection with one tiny little iPod, which itself looks now horribly outdated. But I'm a nerd. I still have some of my CDs and the iPod. But yeah, there was definitely this idea that have less, have smaller things, have digital things, and that's the way of the future.
And it's interesting in a sense that if you look at the resurgence of vinyl records in the 2010s, like a lot of the narrative around it was like, oh, these, retro hipsters want to get records because it makes them seem like, unique and cool. And, I was one of those people to some extent. Like I liked having records. But I think as well with the digitization of all these things, there is a loss of the experience of interacting with them. And it's something that I'll get into in a minute. But like when you have a vinyl record, you put it on and you listen to it. It's not like you can, scroll. Well, you can scroll on Instagram while you listen to a vinyl record, but the experience of putting it on and interacting with a physical object is fundamentally different than like clicking the exact same song on Spotify. For me, I think the story of listening and interacting with music is fundamentally different when the relationship is mediated through a digital interaction rather than like physical media.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Last time I was back in Australia visiting my parents, we spent a good few evenings going through Dad's record collection and pulling things out and listening to them. And, you can't just press skip if you don't like the song. You've got to decide, is it worth getting up, trying to work out how far to move the needle, or do you just listen?
I know, but even at like that is a perfect example of like physical objects telling us something about someone, in that like you had that experience with your dad, like going through the records and stuff, and like when you go into someone's home, their things tell you, the objects in their home tell you things about them. And it's the same, you mentioned books are the same, that like, I love going into my friends' houses and like looking at what books they have on the shelf and what records they might have, and like it tells a interesting story about someone. Like can't really do that in my apartment because I have the most insane shit I need for work, that like there are books that are sequestered away on a very high shelf that like if I have friends over, they're not going to pick up. It's like, oh, here's the history of Modcon book. Oh, there's someone getting their balls sliced open. That's not good conversation to have over dinner. But the and this is not to be, a like a Luddite or a Ted Kaczynski. We need to return to living in a cabin in nature. It's that like our interactions with the things that we own, the objects that we interact with that give us entertainment or tell us about the world or tell us about ourselves, the disappearance of those into a little black box that we keep in our pocket all the time has removed a certain amount or abstracted a certain amount of our personhood away from our physical space.
Wow, that's getting really deep. But yeah, I agree. It's I've done the same thing, like gone to a friend's house and spent the first 5 minutes examining their bookshelf. It's great fun.
Yeah, and but even I suppose to go deeper, like one massive problem that we have in terms of like historical preservation and looking to the past is in the future. I know people talk about a digital dark age where we're experiencing the disappearance of data online, in terms of it's something as simple as a streaming service taking a show off and there's no physical media of it and it just doesn't exist anymore. It's almost as if it didn't exist anymore. And then you have I'll give an example. For example, we, as people who work in historical preservation and are interested in history, we know so much more about history because there was the discovery of physical items that contained information that allowed us to learn about the people who owned them, who created them, and the society around them. So that could be personal correspondences in terms of letters, photographs, books that they own that had little annotations in them.
Mm.
All these things now exist on our phones, and for better or for worse, for example, Apple, like, unless you know someone's password, you cannot get into their phone. And if someone passes away and all of their personal data and correspondence and stuff exist in this little black box that's completely inaccessible, and the only way to gather information about them post-mortem is through interactions or interviews and interactions with people that they interacted with in their lives. And those stories can be influenced by their personal relationship, a kind of historicization of the person, and a million different factors. But the like the letters that people send to each other in times past illuminates so much about them as people. And you're never going to get access to someone who's passed away's WhatsApp unless you have access to their phone. And that element of history is really at risk. And it brings it back to the point of the personhood, is that, like, now that we have abstracted so much of ourselves into like a closed system walled garden, there's only so much that we can know about each other, but also like so much we can know about ourselves. And when we pass away, so much less that the world can learn about us after we're gone.
Yeah, and it's those little fragments of social history that often don't get captured elsewhere. I bought an antique postcard recently, and just the little paragraph on the back of it just tells me so much about the relationship between these two people, the etiquette of the time it was written, and just everything like that. And you can't get that from protected WhatsApp messages.
And even if they are protected or not, it's also the element of observation changes our interactions. Like, we are aware that most of our communications are mediated through a third party out of the control of ourselves and the person we're communicating with. How, when you look at like letters that people sent each other, to their closest confidants, they're revealing so much about them that you wouldn't have otherwise known, or no one else would have known in their lives. And there is an element of that doesn't exist anymore, because one, there's a digital performance aspect of it, that like we are constantly aware that we are being observed and perceived, so that alter our behavior a little bit. But it also creates an element of like how much of that then affects who we really are inside ourselves. Like, it's the Kafka thing. It was like, I showed up to the party wearing a mask and everyone had their real, or I showed up to a party with my real face and everyone else had a mask on, type thing. But I was supposed to bring it back to like Discworld and the importance of history. I sent you last night a band called Pachiko.
Yep, you did.
So Pachiko were a kind of a uncategorizable band from the UK who, they were like I suppose you call them indie rock, kind of a little bit like Mogwai type stuff, that were existed for 2 years, or no, it was get my dates right, for a couple of years in the late 90s and early 2000s. And they made an album. They made a demo, they made an album, and they disbanded. I think one of them went to college and it's just kind of petered out a little bit. And then in 2016, a copy of their album Death Metal was found in an Oxfam, and it was posted online on 4chan, and people were fascinated by this. They were like, "What the fuck is this?" And then eventually, there was a ripped copy uploaded online, but the disc itself had suffered severe disc rot, so the actual music was altered through this physical degradation of this digital medium. And it created this like fascination with people trying to figure out who these people were, because there was no information on really on the liner notes that would lead to who the people were. People thought it was a hoax, etc., etc. And it eventually led to the lead singer getting a message on Facebook saying, like, "Are you the lead singer of Pachinko?" He was like, "Yeah." And like this guy, it was a band, they were all kids when they formed it. This guy was in his late 30s. And it was just like this fascination with an undiscoverable quality of this music because of the degradation of the CD. Eventually, Pachinko reformed and went on tour and released a properly mixed and mastered version without the disc rot of the album and some early singles as well. And it just like created this fascination with this band that like disappeared into nowhere. You know, the way a lot of bands do. They form, they write some music, and then it's like either you kind of make it and or you stick it out, or you just like realize it's like we're not going to be like Stereophonics, and then they break up. And like Pachinko are still going today. Like they've released new music, they have like a huge fan base, and it's like I think that story wouldn't have happened without this CD rotting and being posted with like no real information and people being fascinated with like, this sounds really fucking weird. What is it?
Yeah, it was really fascinating to listen to the contrast, because the rotted versions, I guess you could say, were very eerie and kind of had their own sort of haunting or artistic quality. But yeah, it was definitely interesting to see how that would grab people's attention, because it did have that spooky side to it.
I think it was also there was a kind of mystery to it as well. As like,
Yeah.
Because I go to record shops and I just like buy loads of shit that I don't know what it is, and it's kind of like that discovery element. And online now over the past 10 years, there's this like growing fascination with like mysterious songs that no one knows who made them and stuff. And these like Pachinko were kind of the original version of that. I would recommend going to listen to it. The music is very good, but I think there is a fundamental element of that story of the fragility of this format that everyone thought was going to be the permanent future. And it kind of highlighted the impermanence of both the media of the CD, but also I think an element of impermanence of youth and like the passing of youth, of like, you know, starting a band when you're young and sticking it out for a couple of years and then realizing that time has passed and something's not going to happen, and you eventually have to kind of leave that in the past and let it become a memory, similar to the CD that just ended up in an Oxfam.
Yeah, that's getting deep again, but yeah, I think that's no, it's great. I love it. But yeah, there is that story in there of, you know, when you're starting a band and you're 18, you think that's going to go on forever, and then yeah, life happens.
And even the interesting thing of this is an ever-present flaw with data storage formats, and even that like hard drive discs that then replaced, you know, CDs and DVDs. It's a smaller disc inside of it that is also prone to failure because of scratching, because of dislodging, because of the mechanical parts in it. Even SSDs, if you don't like plug in an SSD for too long, the SSD stores data through as electrical currents between two transistors. If you leave it too long, that current dies and then all the data is gone with it. So, and once again, environmental factors can affect that. The warmer it is, the quicker that charge goes. And I think it's interesting as someone who I suppose works in the history space of, it almost feels like now it's even more pertinent that we are in a race against time, that like all of the physical media that hasn't been preserved or isn't being stored is like degrading faster and faster and faster. And even the digital media in a physical form also degrades. If you look at stuff that's stored online, that's even more of a treacherous path to walk, because if someone stops paying for the hosting for the website, it's just gone.
Yeah.
But it's, for me, I like collecting books. I like taking, analog photos using 35mm film. I like records, but I also like, good storage and backup practices. I think the tale that's really old as time is that once a established data storage system becomes innovated upon or is made somewhat obsolete, everyone moves on
Oh, yeah.
without really thinking about the consequences of leaving all that stuff behind. And
Yeah.
even like looking at me from my desk is 3 volumes of Punch cartoons from 1853 up until the mid 60s.
Oh, wow.
And there's stuff in those that I'm sure maybe the families of the illustrators would like to forget. The publication would probably like to forget. And we see now, because of the internet being centralized around a handful of sites and those sites being at the whims of the people who own them, information that they would rather forget just disappears. And that once again makes historical preservation harder. And it's phenomenal that so many people put in good efforts of screenshotting tweets and all this sort of stuff. So the evidence still remains. But I often think about when I was a teenager and I got my first laptop. I spent so much time on torrent sites, on forums, like dead forums about punk music that no one had posted on. In this would have been the early 2010s. Like no one had probably posted on in about 10 years.
Mhm.
And like the hosting was still up for them. So I was like grabbing demos and grabbing, MP3s and listening to them and like expanding my understanding of the world through this almost like abandoned building that was still standing. And we get to do less and less of that now, as
Yeah.
our interaction with the world is through digitally mediated platforms that are at the whim of the people who control them.
Yeah, that is, online lives are both more curated and, if the platform owner doesn't like a thing, it's just gone, which,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, you've reminded me, I was recently trying to track down a band that I knew some people from at university. And I actually do still have a couple of MP3s of their music on my laptop, but there is nothing on the internet that I could find about them. And I think that's probably deliberate on the part of some of the members who it was a satire and kind of comedy band, but I think
Mhm.
there's some of the content that you wouldn't want an employer finding, that's for sure.
And I think as well, it's like, because I have this debate with myself about when like digitizing VHS tapes is how much restoration to do in terms
Mm,
of the quality of the tape. Is like, should I try to restore it back to what it was originally, or to restore it to the highest quality possible for, that is acceptable for people in 2025? Or is there an element of what the tape looks like now that is important? And this goes, I suppose, more into the realm of art preservation, that when you look at art restorers, there is a debate about how much alteration work to a piece is acceptable. Obviously, there's the famous Potato Jesus a couple of years ago. And like, at what point, it's a bit of a ship of Theseus question, but like, at what point does the restoration overtake the original piece? And obviously, like in the work that I do, I don't think it's possible, because what's important is the information that is being get from it, less so it being a piece of historical artifact that stands on its own, that's less so the point. But I think, like when you look at Pachinko, if you look at the album Death Metal on Spotify, they have the original Rotted versions there as well, because some people prefer those because that is what that album is to them, rather
Yeah.
than the clean and restored version. And
Mhm.
like with your friends' MP3s, like they're important to exist as they are as well, because it gives, like I said at the start of this episode, it gives more context for both the times, but them as people as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I think there is a risk of cleaning stuff too much, because I actually noticed in the sort of non-rotted version of one of the Pachinko songs, they have a sort of artificial record crackle on there,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and obviously that's come about because vinyl crackled sometimes, and that was
Mm-hmm.
kind of something that made it unique and special. And yeah, you don't want to hit the point where you're restoring that out. But at the same time, like, we've got some very old family film that I think it was originally 8mm and then got put
Mm-hmm.
onto VHS and then got put onto DVD. And I've now got several backup copies of it in various places digitally. But it's like there's so much distortion has crept in those places. How much would we want to potentially address that, but not take out that original 8mm film quality to it that is part of its charm?
And the ironic thing is that distortion makes that video much more representative of how human memory actually works,
Yeah, yeah,
because
absolutely.
of the additional details and the obfuscation of other details in favor of a kind of cleaner narrative as we remember things. But you made an interesting point about like the vinyl crackle, in that I can't remember who said it, but it was, once a technology becomes obsolete, we become nostalgic for the things that were an annoyance at the time. Like, I find it
Yeah.
really funny when, music that has been digitally recorded and digitally mastered is put on a vinyl record. It's like, that's kind of fucking pointless. It just, like, that feels, yes, it's an aesthetic choice and it's a commercial point, but it's like it kind of defeats the purpose. And it's like you see guitar players trying to, replicate the sounds of like albums from the 70s, when if you probably asked the people who made them at the time, they're probably like, oh, I hate this thing. It's like the gain is like, it's way too sensitive. I can't, go any louder without it breaking up. And it's the same with when you look at people who try to replicate the characteristics of analog media like VHS tapes. They always go a step too far, and makes it like, for someone who works with it, it's like this doesn't look realistic, because it's like you have tried to replicate what is your memory of what it looked like, and that is being done through the lens of nostalgia. And if you actually just like do get a VHS tape of Shrek 1 or 2 and put it in a VHS player, it's not going to look that way.
Yeah, that it definitely is a really good point, that sort of
Mhm.
nostalgia exaggeration of things. Like, I see stuff that's supposed to be from the 80s that looks like that original original 8-bit, not 8-bit, what am I talking
Mhm.
about? 8mm film. It's like that was not the 80s, guys.
Yep. Yep. And it's also as well, like, as we move further away from the time of the prevalence of physical media, like you said, those kind of periods like start to blend together. Like, no, I when I'm watching a movie that's meant to be set as perfect time, there's an anachronism, and I was like, well, that wasn't, the way it was back then. And whatever it, probably makes me annoying to watch movies with, but it's like the nostalgia that like teenagers and people in their early 20s have for compact digital cameras. And I think obviously that's a reaction to the prevalence of our smartphones and technology in our lives, that there's this kind of abstracted separate thing to go and take photos on a night out with. It's primarily an aesthetic thing to upload on Instagram, but I think it's really interesting, and people moving towards using camcorders from the late 2000s, and it's like, I remember using them. They fucking sucked.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's another VHS we've got lying around somewhere of some very wobbly footage of trees mostly. But yeah,
Or
they
even
sucked.
like early kind of like mid 2000s, like Panasonic digital camcorders. Like, we were all frustrated by the limitations of them, but now that we are far enough removed from them, and technology has moved so far past it, that we are nostalgic for, I suppose, the personal and cultural memory they represent of, like, the past is always a simpler time, mainly because, you get older, you have more shit to deal with as an adult. And there is a security and a comfort in the past, and the aesthetics and ephemera from the past then kind of work its way into your mind as this was a better past than it was. I was talking to someone recently, and we were talking about, memories of being teenagers and 18 and everything. And they were like, I can't believe, I'm going to be, it's going to be 10 years since I was 18. And I was like, I wouldn't want to be 18 again. I was fucking miserable when I was 18. Why would I want to be 18 again? But I'm kind of like, do you know what? I'm listening to, Caius again, like I was when I was 18, and all these sort of things that I suppose represent a kind of comforting memory for me. But, you know, memory is kind of like the disc rot of the mind.
Yeah, it's easy to just cling to the fun bits, or to the, distorted version. I've been digging up some of my old CDs
Yeah.
from my late teens, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is a good song. I should listen to more often. But I haven't quite got to the wanting to be 16 again. 16 was not fun.
Mm-hmm. And it's like, trying to tell people is like trying to go anywhere before Google Maps in an area you're unfamiliar with. Nightmare. Trying to find out if a business is open or not. Nightmare. Like, there's so many things that, because of ergonomics and efficiencies, we've kind of smoothed down the friction of daily life. But I think about it, one of my favorite things when I go to a new city is just wander around and like figure out where I end up. Like, I remember.
Oh, I got halfway through writing a blog post about this and stopped, so I might have to dig that out, because, the first few times I traveled, it was, sort of pre-smartphone. I don't think it was quite pre-Google Maps, but, I was still having to get out the tube map when I first came to London and work out which line would get me to which thing, and that sort of thing. And yeah, there was a bit of fun in that, because, if you took a wrong turn and you just ended up walking and walking, and then you found a different tube station, and suddenly you could get oriented again. And yeah.
I think as well, it's like there's a really fun element of discovery in that, and I don't think it's necessarily that people don't want to do that anymore. I think it's people have maybe become a little bit more risk averse, especially, people don't necessarily have the money to go into a random restaurant and have a bad meal. That money's valuable. But I think about a couple of years ago, I got invited to speak at the European Brewers Conference in Madrid. It was based off my undergrad thesis, and I speak, very, very basic Spanish, enough to kind of be in Spain on my own and get by. And they paid for my flights over, all this sort of stuff, and I was staying in a hostel in Madrid, and I was like, do you know what? I'm going to go for a walk around. I don't really know the area. And I landed down and just wandering around, was like, I'm going to go for a beer. I'll figure out wherever. Found a beer, and like, it's like, I wonder if there's any like kind of rock bars or whatever. So I found one, and it was underneath a block of flats with a giant steel door on the front. And I went in. There was no windows. There was a guy in there behind the bar, and I assume his coworker and she was sitting in front of the bar just talking. And I like went in, ordered a beer, and just like kind of was just kind of soaking it in. And I didn't have enough Spanish to have a conversation with them. Had no English at all. And next thing, all of the local metalheads were like coming in. It was just like, and one of them was like trying to make conversation with me, and I was like, it was kind of half in English, half in broken Spanish, like eventually figuring out how to talk to each other. And I left maybe 2 hours later. It was still so bright outside. I felt like I was going blind when I walked out. But like, it was such a fun experience and such a fun memory that I just like wouldn't have had if I was like, oh well, let me look up the reviews of this place, and you know, trying to trying to mitigate the risk of having a bad experience in somewhere.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. I think some of my best travel experiences and just generally things have been like random. Oh, let's check this thing out, or let's walk this way and find this thing. And I do think we can overmanage our lives and not have those random experiences.
Yeah, I think much like as we have tried to progress data storage to the point of like minimizing the physical space and the efficiency, and removing any of the kind of pitfalls of the physicality of it, we have kind of done that a little bit with our lives and made it more efficient, made it easier, but we have taken out all the friction that provides an interesting life of the crackle of the vinyl, or like going into a bar and like talking to random people, or having to stop someone on the street to ask us like, oh, where's this or that, or like a video cassette that's a little bit fucked up and has like weird ads taped at the front of it. It's like, by removing and trying to make life as ergonomic as possible, we have lost something in it.
Yeah, sometimes those weird ads are the best bit, talk about context and history.
Yeah, and it's like one of the tapes I was digitizing for someone, like there was maybe 20 minutes of what I was looking for, and then there was another 40 minutes of like videos about dogs, like about lurchers and hunting dogs. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't really know that about that person. And it's like, we have, in order for efficiency and for, making our lives as smooth and easy as possible, which, I think is an admirable goal. A lot of us lead quite, hard and difficult lives. And I think those people deserve a bit of ease. I think we have smoothed out some of the edges, and, the point of being alive is to live. And, the point of a vinyl record is that it crackles and it sounds a particular way.
I mean, I will make a case that there are definitely reasons to have digital backups as well.
Yes, 100%.
There's so many books and sources that, have been incredibly useful for me. I'm trying to write a historical fiction novel at the moment, and, there's records from Australia. You'll be familiar with the digital panopticon, obviously. And, there was a pamphlet written aimed at people migrating from Scotland to Australia in like 1880 something, and that's been digitized. And like without that, there's no way I would have got my hands on the original. There's no way I would have been able to find out that information. And that's
these things can
that's amazing.
Yeah, these things can coexist, and it's important that they do that. Like both the physical and the digital exist at the same time. And yeah, I suppose if I was to close on a point, is that like these things, like these physical things matter, and by trying to mitigate kind of any negative consequence of physical media or either negative consequence or unpleasant experience in life, we have removed a lot of the beauty of it. And, there is beauty in the flaws in everything. And, a thing that I always say to myself is like one of the, important things is, to live in the world, to be part of it. And I think, unfortunately, your CDs rotting, your Limp Bizkit CDs rotting on the shelf is a part of life.
Yeah, I think that beauty in the flaws is a really key point there. I actually, as I was saying, I dug out some CDs from when I was a teenager, and there's one where the original had the apostrophe in the wrong place on the title, and they fixed it on subsequent releases. I'm like, why would you fix that? That's just such a beautiful little fragment of this EP.
Yeah.
It was an EP produced, very low budget, very, backyard sort of, maybe not quite that low budget, but, and then the band got big a few years later. And, I managed to get my hands on one of their EPs from before they were big, and it has this error on the cover, and I absolutely love it. And then they fixed that. So yeah.
Did they fix it or did they make it worse?
Possibly both.
Yeah, it's easy to be old man yells at cloud about this stuff, and I think it's important to be a bit circumspect about it. That like all this stuff is important, and yeah, I don't know. Go listen to Pachiko.
That was definitely enjoyed that, and I'm glad you shared it with me.
Sorry, Pachiko. I realize I've been calling them Pachinko, and that is a gambling machine in Korea, if I'm correct. It's Pachiko.
Okay, right. I'm not a skilled enough audio editor to fix that for you in post. I'm sorry.
It's fine. Leave it in.
The errors are beautiful after all.
Exactly.
So, I mean, all of my 10 or so listeners are probably already familiar with your work, given you it's a top 10 podcast now that you're producing.
Yeah, I actually produce every podcast. Every podcast you could possibly listen to, I am the producer of, either directly or indirectly, in some form. But yeah, listen, if you enjoyed, I suppose, this conversation, this is kind of more of the realm from me, anyway, for Beneath the Skin that I host with Dr. Matt Lauder. Say history of everything told through the history of tattooing. We have a lot of conversations like this. If you enjoy historiography, check out This Guy Sucked. It's a new podcast I produce, hosted by Dr. Claire Alban. It's about, guys in history who sucked. And you probably already listened to Lions Led by Donkeys, so I don't think I need to explain that one.
Yeah, I mean, my parents might not, but I'm not sure I want them listening to it either, so...
Yeah, I don't either.
Well, thanks again for joining me. It's been absolutely great.
Thanks so much for having me.
As with last episode, my sources are on my website, which now has a proper domain, www.ourstoriesandourselves.com. If you have thoughts, you can drop me an email at ourstoriesandourselves@gmail.com or on Blue Sky at ourstories.bluesky.social. The next episode will be out in 2 weeks, and topic is still fully to be determined, but will probably be something about reality and fiction and how fiction can affect reality. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and leave a review, like the video on YouTube, all the algorithm feeding options, or tell your friends, the real life alternative. Many thanks again to Tom and to everyone who's been supporting the podcast, giving me feedback, and see you in 2 weeks.